Good morning, friends. This is Dr. Vipul Kapoor again. I welcome you all for our next lecture on poetry. Friends, in the last lectures, we discussed the definitions of poetry, elements of poetry, the power of poetry, the revealing power of poetry, and all. And in this lecture, we want to discuss science and poetry. W.H. Hudson has given two terms in his book An Introduction to the Study of Literature, and these two terms are scientific truth and poetic truth. So, in this lecture, we want to understand science and poetry, and we'll be doing a kind of comparative study of the poetic truth and scientific truth. Friends, science and poetry are very ancient branches of knowledge. Poetry is as old as science, or vice versa, science is as old as poetry. When the scientific treatises were written in the ancient times in Greece, I'm talking about the 5th or 6th century BC, during the times of Socrates or even before the times of Socrates, hundreds of scientific treatises were written. But to your surprise, let me tell you that those scientific treatises were written in the poetic form. So, poetry and science were living together even during the ancient times. Even if you have a look at our Indian science, Indian ancient science, then in the ancient times, all Indian ethos, Indian Ayurveda science, Indian medicine, all the treatises were written in poetic forms. So here in India also, science and poetry were living together since time immemorial. Friends, science and poetry, one more comparison you can do between these two is that, both rely on metaphors. Science progresses on metaphors and poetry also lives on metaphors. But still, there is a gap, there are some differences between science and poetry. Science deals with the world of facts or the world of appearances. But on the other hand, poetry deals with what is known as what is not seen by our eyes. Or you can say poetry deals with what we can't listen to with our ears. Or you may say that poetry deals with what we can't feel with our hearts. So friends, there are two worlds, you can say. One, the world which you can see with your eyes, that is the world of appearances. And science deals with that world. And there is another world which is not seen with our physical eyes. And that world is seen by the poets. And that world is expressed by poetry. So that is the basic difference between science and poetry. Let's take one example, that when there is a flower in a garden, and if you ask a gardener pointing out at the flower, then the gardener would answer. If you ask the gardener what this flower is, then he would say it's a lily. But if you ask the same question to a botanist or to a scientist, then he would answer that it is a type of Hexandria monogenea. His answer is different. Why? Because he is a scientist, he is a botanist. He says that this flower is a type of Hexandria monogenea. Why? Because his way of looking at the flower is different. So the gardener's answer is different from that of a botanist, from that of a scientist. In the same manner, if you ask a poet, what is this? Pointing out at the flower, then the poets like Edmund Spencer was a poet, a very famous poet of English literature writing during Elizabethan age. If you ask this question to Edmund Spencer, then he would say that this flower is actually the lady of the garden. So Spencer uses a metaphor for the flower. Similarly, if you see a beautiful woman and pointing out at the beautiful woman, if you ask a scientist to explain about the beauty of the lady, then the scientist measures the beauty of a lady by considering the golden ratio of beauty, scientific ratio of beauty called PHI, which is actually a measure of physical perfection. But if you ask, on the other hand, if you ask a poet to describe the beauty of a lady, then according to the poet, something or somebody is beautiful only when it appeals, when she appeals his heart. Okay, and that's the reason why if you ask the same question pointing out at a beautiful lady, if you ask this question to Kalidasa is a famous Sanskrit poet, then he would say Anagatam Pushpam. That means untouched flower. This is how Kalidasa has described his character Shakuntala. So there is a difference between a poet and a scientist, between poetry and science. Science looks at the things as they are, and poetry looks at the same things as they don't look to be, as they don't seem to be. The poet dives deep into the hidden meanings of the things, and the poet mainly uses metaphors to express the things. Moreover, just opposite to science, you can say that poetry has a deeper relationship with philosophy. Science has nothing to do with philosophy. Science does not talk about the philosophical ideas, okay, but poetry does. Like philosophy, poetry dives deeper into the things or ideas, and poetry brings about the connotative meanings. Science can explain only denotative things or denotative meanings, but poetry can explain the connotative meanings of the things. Connotative means what? Deeper meanings, and denotative means the superficial meanings. Science can explain only denotative meanings. Matthew Arnold, an important critic of the Victorian era, 19th century, he believes in the grand power of poetry. He says that this grand power of poetry is the power which can awaken in us a full and intimate sense of things. So, according to Arnold, the basic job of the poet is to awaken in the readers a kind of intimacy or intimate sense of understanding the things which are presented by the poets. Now, interpretations are given by science, but these interpretations don't give us the intimate sense of objects which is done by the poets only, which is done by poetry only. Okay? Science appeals to a limited faculty of human existence and not the whole man. Science appeals our intellect, but on the other hand, it is poetry which appeals our intellect as well as our heart, as well as our faculty of feeling, faculty of emotions. It appeals our mind and heart at the same time. Let's take one example. W.H. Hudson has given this example which you can see on the screen. Hudson has given this example in order to differentiate between science and poetry. Now, this one stanza Hudson has taken from a poem, and in this stanza, the poet tries to describe the weather, the sea, the clouds, and the wind. Let's read it and then let's see what's the difference between science and poetry. The poet writes that the east wind gathered all unknown, a thick sea cloud his course before. He left by night the frozen zone and smote the cliffs of Labrador. He slashed the coast on either hand, and betwixt the Cape and the Newfoundland, into the bay his armies pour. Now, this same stanza, if you ask a scientist, then it is humorous to see how a scientist explains this. You can see here on the screen, a scientist describes the weather in this manner. He writes, an area of extreme low pressure is rapidly moving up the Atlantic coast with wind and rain. Storm center now off Charleston, south coast, wind northeast, velocity 54, barometer 29.6. The disturbance will reach New York on Wednesday and proceed eastward to the banks and bay of St. Lawrence. Danger signals order for all North Atlantic ports. So this is how, this is a kind of weather report, but the same weather report, if you ask a poet to write, he would do like this, which you can see on the screen. So their style of presentation is again different when we are talking the difference between science and poetry. In the same manner, let's take the views given by William Wordsworth. William Wordsworth, who was a romantic poet, in his preface to lyrical ballads, he considers poetry to be superior to science. He shows that the scientist studies only the appearance of the things, while the poet investigates the inner reality of human soul. So that's what I told you in the beginning of this lecture today, that science deals with appearances, deals with the world of appearances. And on the other hand, the poet tries to investigate the inner reality of the things, the inner reality of the human soul. The realization of the unity of nature and man gives absolute pleasure to the poet. Things don't give pleasure to a scientist, but things in this world give pleasure to a poet. A scientist is devoid of this pleasure. Scientist does not enjoy the things when he looks at the things. He enjoys pleasure in solitude, whereas poetic truth can be shared by all. You know, the scientist does not enjoy the things, or if at all he enjoys in solitude, means he alone can enjoy it. But on the other hand, a poet, when he looks at the things, he himself enjoys, and not only that, through his poetry, he makes his readers enjoy the things. And that is the difference between science and poetry. The poet's appeal, Wordsworth says, is to the intellect as well as to the heart. You know, that's what I told you, that poet appeals to our intellect as well as our heart, and a scientist appeals only to the intellect. Wordsworth thinks that the time may come when science will change and alter the way material conditions of life. When that happens, the poet will give feeling and emotional coloring to the factual achievement of science. Wordsworth believes that a time will come when, science will demand poetry. Science will be in need of poetry in order to color his investigations. And at that time, the poets will give feeling and emotions to the investigations done by science. Okay, so that's what Wordsworth believes about the future. According to him, the dull and dry skeleton of science will be given life and vividness, flash and blurred through the art of poetry. And that's why Wordsworth says that poetry is a higher truth, poetic truth is a higher truth than the scientific truth. Another critic in English literature, Matthew Arnold, a Victorian poet and a critic, he in his critical writing, The Study of Poetry, he also, repeats, or you can say echoes Wordsworth's view that science would remain incomplete without poetry in future. He says that the breadth and finer spirit of knowledge. He says that poetry is the breadth and finer spirit of knowledge. In fact, the atmosphere of sensation only matters, and he takes his surroundings for his subject. Even the objects of science are put to poetic sensation, and the discoveries of the chemist, the botanist, or the mineralogist will also be the objects of the poet's art. So the objects are similar. What the scientist looks at, how the scientist looks at the world. Okay, a chemist looks at the world, or a botanist looks at the world, and the poet also looks at the world, but their understanding is different. Their understanding of the world is different. Not only that, the poet will aid the science to bring it before all in a decisive form in the coming days with its divine spirit. And that's why, Matthew Arnold goes with Wordsworth and says that, poets are one step ahead of the scientists. And he says that poetry is as immortal as the heart of man. He says that poetry, Matthew Arnold said that poetry is going to live as long as the human hearts are throbbing with various emotions and passions. Poetry is not a photographic presentation of the world of appearances. It does not do what the science does. Poetry imitates this life, this world, but poetry does not imitate life in a photographic manner. Okay? Poetry, in fact, is based on the basic elements of human nature. the universal aspects of human life. Poetry ignores the non essentials, removes the irrelevancies, and concentrates on the essentials. And that is why poetry is universal. Poetry presents the universal while history deals with particular events. Here we can compare poetry with history. History deals with what? History deals with particular things. But poetry presents those particular things but makes them universal. You know, and that is why you can say that poetry is quite ahead of science and history too. True. Poetic truth is higher than that of history. The particular object taken by the poet is transfigured so that the higher truth, the idea of the universal, shines throughout it. This is what Matthew Arnold said. So, in short, we can say that there are two terms, poetic truth and scientific truth, but all in all, no doubt science is important in human life, but at the same time, the critics like Hudson or the critics like Wordsworth or Matthew Arnold believe that a time will come when science will be in need of poetry, in order to make the findings or investigations of science colorful. The science will need poetry, because poetry is an art which which appeals directly to the heart to the soul and heart of man. And that's why poetry is greater than science and history. So, friends, here we end up this discussion on poetic and scientific truth. Here, if you have any questions or doubts about this, you may ask questions later on. Thank you. Thank you very much.